So, when we last left our poor, pathetic victims, they had just entered the Sanctum. Now, I was really excited about this because this is actually the first time at which this party had ever actually encountered one of my dungeons. I've talked about this before, viewers, so forgive me for a little bit of repetition, but I've always tried to do my dungeons in basically a completely different style to standard D&D. Standard D&D, rooms, traps, monsters, and checks. That's basically what it comes down to in a nutshell. I've always liked to design my dungeons in what I like to call the Zelda style, making you think, having things that are engaging. And of course, it has to all make sense from an in-character perspective. Everything has to be there for a reason. It can't just be there because it's interesting for the dungeon. Nothing that's purely a gameplay mechanic. So it's always been an interesting challenge to me, but it's always been something that I really enjoy doing. So, this is the first time the party had actually encountered one of these, and I was really, really nervous. So they go in to the first sanctum. I'm going to actually pull up my notes here of what happened so I could really make sure I get all the details, because a lot of foreshadowing, a lot of interesting stuff happened during this course of action. And again, as I mentioned last time, everything that's about to happen occurs over the course of about 5 hours. So, first thing they do is they go in. Now, Snarg talked with one of the soldiers and said, can you give us some kind of idea, some kind of map, some kind of guidance as to what we're going to find in here? And he told Snarg, and, I told, I'm not going to give you details, but he gives you full, info on what it is. And Snarg's like, awesome, I got it all memorized, I'm ready. And he rushes in, and they go through the antechamber. The first thing they notice is that those directions are completely wrong. And the inside of the facility has been very crudely rewoven, and they immediately found what would soon become the hallmarks of Gerland's defacement. There is a very crude and brutish reweaving of everything, which also has this sort of thought, this mentality that's constantly repeated everywhere, which basically comes across as the word slave. Now, as they go forward, the next thing they find is a massive plain of grass and a lush, clear violet sky, and they were very confused by this because, they're inside a building, but near as I can tell, there's just the door behind them, and this giant plain of grass, a bridge going over a extremely deep, actually effectively bottomless pit, and then a door at the end of that bridge, and then past that it's just emptiness, infinitely leading outwards. And so they're like, okay, now couple other details. There was a small hut, a small wooden hut in the corner of this place, and there was also tall grass coming up to like about here, I'd say, throughout this entire area. Now, as they were going through this, they were trying to figure out what to do, and Firnasil went ahead and walked forward and tried to go through the tall grass. That didn't actually work out too well. Every time she did, this sort of crude scarecrow-looking wooden figure would come rushing out of the grass and attack her. Now, no one else saw this figure, even when they were specifically looking right at her. They saw nothing. They just saw her suddenly wilt to the ground, and they did see the wounds, like the claw marks that it would create as it attacked her would actually appear, but they didn't see anything attacking her. So, based on the circumstance, they decide that the best thing they can do is go ahead and head over to the hut and try to figure out what's in there. So, they basically start hacking. They try to first hack and slash the grass away, and as they do it, they are just overwhelmed and overcome with thoughts of nightmarish horror and death and betrayal and just all the most unpleasant things. And it reaches the point where literally you'd take one swing and then you'd like fall to your knees from the mental onslaught of it. And now they successfully cut the grass, but it reached the point where basically they only managed to cut away a very small portion before they just couldn't take anymore, which was not very long. So they rush over and go through that, and they head towards the hut. Now, inside the hut is a small wand, which they're not entirely sure how to make it work or what it does or anything like that. All they know is that if they use it, they know how to activate it, I'm sorry, but they don't know what it does or why. All they know is that the tip of it is crafted into the shape of a flame, and then there's a little inscription nearby which says, in basic common, "This world must burn." Now, I mention this because they actually still have this wand to this day. But, so they take this wand and they decide they're not going to use this thing. And so they go ahead and they decide to shimmy up on top of the hut and get a rope across to the bridge over the bottomless pit and try to secure it. And then they're going to climb their way over that in order to get over the grass, in order to get over there. Very clever solution, and it completely bypasses several of the problems in that room. Works fairly well. They managed to get across. Props to that. In the next area, Now, see, this area is actually one of the rooms I'd had planned for a while, but I wanted to save it until it really had some impact. I don't know if what your reaction is going to be to this, dear viewer, but I know what the player's reaction was, and it wasn't what I was expecting until I described it after the fact to someone, at which point they realized the severity of what had happened. When they entered this room, they found it was again a large room type thing. The ceiling was incredibly high, and there was I'm trying to think how to best to put this. If the room was at ground level, there's another one of those huts, just very crude, very wooden-looking huts right here, and then there's the ground level, and then there's this cliffside leading up here, right? Well, this room is filled with literally several hundred bunny rabbits, okay? Now, the moment they get close to any one of these bunny rabbits, a little electrical charge shoots out from it and zaps the person, Rory in this case, and does 1 damage to him. Now, the party instantly realizes the danger, because 100 bunny rabbits doing 1 damage each, and given their proximity, getting through them would be very, very difficult without getting shocked, if not flat out impossible. So they're trying to figure out what exactly to do about this situation. Because on the far wall, there's this ladder thing up here, which is pretty clearly where they're supposed to go. Snarg goes and examines the hut again, because he's the one who examined the previous hut, and he's the one who knows psionic. He gets in there, and he sees a trap, which he narrowly avoids, and a small crystalline orb, which has a lot of rushing energies going within it. And he sees over there a message in psionic at this time that says, "Remember, even the innocent must die." So he goes ahead and tries to grab it, and it starts reacting to him immediately. Now, this is actually really funny, because it wasn't actually going to do anything until he dropped it. But naturally, because this mysterious orb has started reacting, the very first thing Snarg does is drop it. What happens next is, over the course of 7 minutes, give or take, each one of the orb erupts, and this energy goes flying across the room, and each one of the rabbits dies, one by one, over and over and over again. Each one of them screaming in horrific pain as its life is snuffed out, one after another after another, as all 200-ish of the bunnies die one by one. Now, not really sure what to make of that, they go ahead and decide to just try and move on. And at about this point, well, I'll get to that in a minute, they go up the platform, and they go up the ladder, up and top. Now, the way this works here, this was the plane where the bunnies were, and then there's this tall wall here, right? The ceiling is actually above this wall. This wall is basically a divider of the room. And on this other side, there are 2 pits which they can basically drop into. One of which they don't see anything in, and the other which has grass in it. Over the one that has nothing in it, it says, "Follow your greed." And the other one, it doesn't say anything. Now, at about this point, the party's getting really pissed off, especially Snarg, because they're starting to think that all that's happening is this is just some kind of big game to Gerlin, and he's trying to get them to dance to his tune or whatever. And so from this point on, they try to refuse to acquiesce to his, insane request and his little fun house. And so they try to do whatever they can to avoid that. So they ignore the greed pit, and instead go ahead and go into the other pit. Now, here's the interesting part. When they go into the greed pit, when they go into the non-greed pit, the greed pit, the floor opens up, and thousands upon thousands of gold coins fall into it. And of course, if they were to fall in, they'd probably die from the impact at this point. However, when they go into the other pit, what happens is, as they fall, it's quite a large drop, the wind actually buffets and catches them halfway down and lowers them safely to the ground. However, this is the interesting part, there's actually no way back up. And they realize very shortly that they're basically trapped in this room, and the only way to go is forward through the door that's in front of them. So they're like, okay. Now, in the door ahead of them, they see a number of very, very small, yet nevertheless, magma golems. Now, several of the party members knows what a magma golem is, but suffice it to say, it is one of the worst and most powerful types of golems. It's the kind of thing you only would see in the Dyers, in other words. So there's a bunch of them there, but each one of them is only about a foot tall. And I forget exactly how many I decided there were there. It was a specific number, but there's about 20 of them, okay? And they're just kind of hanging out in that room. Now, anytime they go into the room, all of the magma golems immediately start rushing towards you. However, once you leave, they all go back to where they were. So they're like, okay. Now, the party actually spent a really long time in this room. It's actually kind of funny. But long story short, if you'll forgive me for skipping over all of them debating and deliberating, they found out through experimentation that whoever was the healthiest who went in, whoever was the most hardy, would be the one the golems would track on for the most part. So, you know, they're like, they would send someone to distract so that someone could go through, because on the other side of this room was some kind of a rune, which was magically sealing something. They couldn't figure out what in time, because they were running on a time deadline. And there was another pathway over here into another room. So they rush into this other room. Now, in this other room, there is a really, really detailed granite diorama of a city. Now, it's a city in similar style to Holtberg, lots of spires, lots of tall buildings, that kind of thing. But it's a city they've never seen before. Now, there is over on the side, I can actually describe this to you a little bit easier than I did to them. Hang on just a second. Oh, God. Sorry, my back hurts a lot today. So I'm kind of trying to rest back here. There's a cylinder, okay? And the cylinder is just kind of sitting over here in the corner of the room, and there are spikes coming out of it, right? In all points. Now, this cylinder cannot be lifted. If they try to lift it up, it just refuses flat out. And if they try to tilt it or anything like that, but they can roll it, okay? They can roll it easily. It doesn't even take a strength check. It's just whoosh. Now, if they roll it, it will crush over a portion of the city, completely destroying it and turning it into rubble. And as they do that, they do it once in order to figure out what happens. And as they crush one little section of the city, there is a weird, horrifying scream, and they look back in the room, and where one of the magma golems was, there is now a human who is lying there in his skivvies, bleeding, and as if he'd been punctured in many ways, obviously very dead. And so they're like, okay. And this is another side where they're like, we are not going to do this. We're not going to play Garland's damn games. We're going to figure this out and try to figure out some way to get by this without killing these people. So what they decided to do, this was actually really clever, they would ping-pong based on who had the health. You know, Snarg would come in at this side, so all the creatures would go to here, and then Guido would come in at this side, so the creatures would come back, and they'd ping-pong back and forth, while Coulson, who was already injured and therefore not going to be full at all, could go forward and work on attempting to open the door with the rune, you know, manually. Interesting fact happened, though, that made this a lot easier. Sethos, who was with the party, decided to go ahead and light his pipe up. Now, even though he was, you know, outside of the room at the moment, the act of lighting his pipe and having the fire lit made all of the golems just come straight after him. And they stopped at the door. They didn't actually enter the door after him, thank God. But no matter what anyone else would do, they could not get their attention off Sethos. It was described as very creepy by the players, because these golems, again, they're only about a foot tall. They're all like this. And they have no face, obviously. They have no features, but they do have fingers, grasping implements made of magma, which is just kind of roiling there. And they just had their arms outstretched straight for Sethos as hard as they could, desperately trying to get to him, and just sitting there unmoving as he sits there. It was very unnerving, apparently, which is awesome, because that's what I was going for. Eventually, they go ahead and unlock the ruin. Sethos turns off the fire, and then they go in and they make it into the next room. They make it. Now, this is the first room they've been in where it was clearly made by whoever originally made this place and not Garland. Everything Garland does, I don't know if I've described this properly yet, but it's very crude, it's very brusque. He's absolutely brilliant. He invents stuff that should not be possible to do, but he does so by brute forcing it. He does so by forcing the reality and the magic and the matter in order to acquiesce to his will and in order to bend to his will. And it's not really actually properly designed or engineered or anything like that. So they enter this room, and it's very clearly pristine and well-designed and well-built and well-thought out and all that fun stuff. And as soon as they all get inside, the door slams shut. Shkunk! And they hear the... well, no, they don't hear a voice. But Snarg and Fear Nasil both hear a psionic message that says the testing protocol will now begin. And then they had their first boss fight. Now, this was actually a really fun boss fight for me to do, and some of the party members liked it too. What happened first was there was a liquid golem, a liquid Purial golem that they had to fight. It was very small and very contained. It wasn't a full-scale golem, but still. And then they fought a very large spiked titanium golem. And then after they managed to defeat both, they had to then fight both along with a vapor golem at the same time. And all three had to be balanced and engaged with. It was a lot of fun. I liked what they did with that. But moving along. So they barely beat this guys, and it was actually a pretty rough fight. And Araguna went into downed at least once during this fight. That'll become a trend soon. Undeterred, undaunted, they go ahead and defeat this, and they realize, okay, what do we do now? And Snarg, who, Araguna actually, during the course of the fight, had accidentally come across some information that basically meant some kind of emergency escape or something like that. So they finally decide to go and investigate that. And they realize it leads into what is effectively a control room, analyzing all the data from the thing and whatnot. And Snarg goes in there, psionic reading, and he starts reading the things. And what he learns is interesting. That all of this was done to test very specific augmentations that the Scions had been developing in order to change an individual's soul. And they had been developing this at the behest of an unnamed benefactor to fight an unnamed enemy. Now I mention that because if it was the shadows they were fighting, they would have mentioned that specifically, because there's always this tint. Even if he said unnamed enemy, even if he said our enemy, there would be a tint, because you can't really lie in this psionic speech, as I've mentioned before, of that fear and dread that the shadows engendered within all the Scions, and there was none of that, so shrug. So they decide, Snarg goes ahead, opens the way forward, and they find a teleport pad. Now this is actually the party's first interaction with this teleport pad. This party, obviously the previous party had been interacting with them a lot back in Vassae and Lascelles and Mary Lascelles. The way the pads work is really simple. If you have some unusual means, you can teleport to some place you've never been, but otherwise you can teleport to any place you've already been. Now, as they go here, they find out that it has... Put simply, this one has been specifically designed to allow you to go to the second facility. It has been pre-programmed, so if you go on it, you'll head to the second facility, and that way, the party can proceed. But it's obvious Kirlan wants them to go that way. They weren't sure if they wanted that, but after some thinking, they realized that's basically their only choice, because, remember, there's the magma golems right before them, and they don't want to turn on this test facility again and die, because they barely survived that last encounter, and there's no way out back way anyway, so they finally decide, fine, we'll go forward. The second facility was huge, although they only saw a very small portion of it. Where they ended up, I spent forever designing this place, where they ended up is in a room with 4 doorways, each to the cardinal directions, and they go ahead and take the one that was marked Ley Line Apparatus. Now, as soon as they go in, the door sealed behind them. I went ahead and skimmed over in my talk about this dungeon. Suffice it to say, this is actually okay. The previous, everything up until that boss fight was actually one session, right? I had some feedback with the players, and we determined that, long story short, I probably should tone down the amount of puzzles in these dungeons a little bit, because it was taking them absolutely forever to get through them. Not necessarily a bad thing, but when it comes down to it, it felt like in order to streamline the process, in order to make sure that we actually got somewhere and make sure that the party didn't get worn down by these puzzles, I should go ahead and reduce it. So what actually happened is this next facility they go through was literally just one room, as I would define it, and that one room had several aspects to it and several puzzles to it, and that's all they had to get through all. This included several things like, for example, a elevator that went up into nothingness, figuring out how to use these orbs which exploded on impact into a gush of water, being on top of a platform that stood miles in the air, and what else? Oh yeah, crossing a pseudo bridge, which actually wasn't a real bridge, put simply. And yeah, I'll just skim over all that, like I said. But because the very next thing that happened is they they successfully go through it after, with some effort, admittedly, even though it was one room, one room as I define it. It took them some time, so that worked out pretty well. Then they went ahead and plummeted into this pit. Falling. They fell for quite a while. The very base of it, their fall was slowed, and they landed in a pit with just a little bit of water in the base of it. And as they as they fell, there was a bit of light that slowly started entering into the room bit by bit. And as they looked forward, they saw a Tusker, but this Tusker looked very wrong. Okay? He was about a medium-sized Tusker, which puts him at about 50 feet tall. He had very deep violet fur, and he had no eyes. There were simply empty sockets, which had, you know, the flesh still in there. And his entire body underneath his fur visible, like, because you know, the fur isn't actually the skin, right? The actual skin underneath had these lightning ruins that glowed violet all over him, all over his entire body. And he turned to them and said he'd been waiting for them for some time and immediately lunged to attack. In this fight, they nearly died several times, and in fact, Araguna went into down twice during the course of this fight. It was brutal and it was awesome. It was exactly what I wanted. One of the really, really awesome parts was later on the Tusker showed its ability to morph into a human form, which was actually just as bad because the human was an expert caster. But then, even, you know, towards the further end of the fight, they actually fought the human and the Tusker at the same time. And that nearly went really, really, really bad. And suffice it to say, the party did manage to just barely defeat it in time and bring it down. And as it defeated, the creature basically began to melt into this really viscous purple material that was shocking with lightning here and there and caught on fire. And after a bit, the material kind of fused with the water of the room and oozed out into this way, and it came up and formed a doorway. Now, at this point, I want to mention something that I had mentioned earlier. During this fight, Firnasil manifested a hitherto unknown power. She gained the ability to summon a massive axe about the size of her entire body, made of earth, and she later on summoned 2 twin blades of fire out of her hands, which she was able to use. Similarly, she also had the ability to transform herself into the swirling tornado of Flora, which healed anyone who was within it, which is actually the only reason they survived that last fight, by the way. That being said, one of the next things they tried is they tried to test her psionic powers, Psion, and she couldn't use them. And the more she tried, the more nothing happened, and all of it just failed. And finally, she reached, after significant tests, she realized that she had lost all of her psionic powers, whereas she still had all of her psionic powers with an S. I know it's confusing, that's why I define it. They weren't sure what to make of this, and Firnasil was actually really, really deeply troubled by this. Furthermore, they had no idea when this change had actually happened, because the last time she had tried to use her psionic powers was days ago, and she had no idea what caused her ability to use these massive abilities, so she was at a loss. Excuse me. However, the party had a lot on their mind, so they just moved forward. The next thing they encountered was actually a really, really simple puzzle that I designed for more lore reasons than anything else. Basically, it was this long corridor, okay? However, there's solid ground here, solid ground about halfway through, and a solid ground on the further end. Now, I say solid ground because there's still ground in between that, but it's this oily black material, right? And there's these boulders constantly falling from the infinite blackness above into this room. And when the boulders would hit the black stuff, they would form into a platform, which would only stay for about 6 seconds, and then it would fade and fall in. Now, in some cases, they were like, okay, well, let's see what happens, and they tried to reach into the inky blackness, and what happened is they started getting sucked into it, and they had to be pulled back out, and they're like, okay, we don't want to touch that, got it. So they had to find a way across. Now, there was an obvious solution, which I'm not going to describe in detail for you, because the summary is more important. The obvious solution was to leave some people behind in order to activate a mechanism which would allow some people to get across at the sacrifice of the people who were left behind. The party, obviously that wasn't the intended solution for me, the GM, but obviously that was the intended solution for Gerlin. And the party was like, no, we're not going to leave behind our comrades, that's terrible and awful. And again, of course, they don't want to dance to his tune, they don't want to play Gerlin's game, so they go ahead and find a way across, took some effort, managed to get everyone across. Now, I want to talk about something really quick, because this actually happened earlier during the battle, during the excursion through here, and especially with the battle with the Violet Tusker I just mentioned. Rory was willingly converted into his Tusker form by Firnasil. Now, as they were working with him and as they were examining Rory Tusker, a couple interesting things happened. Up until now, the party, both the players and the characters, had been running under the assumption that the Tusker form was effectively a were form type thing, right? Unfortunately, that's actually not the case as they learn. See, these Tusker minds, these Tusker transmogrifications, were invented by Gerlin. And Gerlin is really, really, really good at what he does, even if he does things that either are wrong or horrible or awful. Because what these Tusker forms are is actually literally another sentient life made out of the same life stuff that made up you. I described this to the party in length. Forgive me for failing at words, but the summary here is if you can imagine the soul of an individual, and that soul manifests in a certain way to present who you are, right? In this case, Rory. Well, what Gerlin did was he created this thing to manifest your soul, who you are, in another way, which would produce this Tusker. In other words, it is a completely separate, segregate living being, sentient being even, that at the same time is made of the exact same being that it originally was. And so the two are very, very distinct separate beings, but only one can actually be functional at a time because they're both made of the same exact material. If you see where I'm going with this. This is the beginning of a dilemma for Rory, and this actually still has not been solved to this day. But long story short, after some discovery with this, they decided to go ahead and name the Tusker. They called him Thog. And yes, that is a reference. I came up with the name, admittedly. But each time, I'm just going to go and give you a little bit of spoiler info, sort of, because, shrug. Each time Rory is converted into Thog, his intelligence and sentience and overall thought capacity has been increasing. That's all I'm going to say about that. So, when they enter the next room, it is a very strange room, because it's clear that it had once been smaller, but it had been kind of shoved outwards, and the central area was this very crude rock and stone, and there were 8 statues of, obviously, scions lining the east and the west walls, one of which they actually recognized as a statue of Gerlin. Now, these 8 statues went in a height, like tallest, the next, and so forth. So the height was clearly delineated so that the tallest was actually, the one of the most important. However, the tallest was not Gerlin himself. He was actually the second tallest. The tallest was a very, very tall man with he was bald, and he had a very strong chin, but no facial hair. The 4 of the statues, including the one of Gerlin, were clearly larger, better carved, and had been manually crafted, not woven, out of solid solid Pyrrole, which implied an incredible amount of skill and time devoted to making those, and so there was obviously some significance there. There were also the names of the 4 larger statues, which were all written in the book that Snorg had seen before, so obviously he didn't know what those names were, he couldn't read it. But, he saw the name Gobbledygook, and he knew that that meant Gerlin because he recognized Gerlin. But otherwise, yeah. Now, over the course of this, I also forgot to mention each one of these statues was carrying something, also made of Pyrrole, a weapon of some type, except for the bald man who was carrying nothing. And I think Gerlin actually was carrying nothing too, now that I think about it. No, Gerlin had a book, didn't he? Anyways, that's semi-significant, but moving along. I guess I'll just go ahead and tell you. There was the tallest gentleman, he was wielding nothing. There was Gerlin, he was wielding a book. Then there was a taller gentleman who was wielding a massive two-handed axe polearm kind of combination deal thing. It was literally larger than Guido was. So, huge, huge weapon. There was a woman, she was wielding what looked like a focus of some kind, very elaborate looking. Then there was a gentleman who was wielding a fist weapon. There was a woman who was wielding something else. I don't actually remember all the details, you'll have to forgive me. But each one of them was wielding something specific, is what I'm trying to get across here. They couldn't really figure out what to do in this room, so Snarg decided to go ahead and mock the Gerlin statue by posing with him and being like, "Yes, I am Gerlin." That actually activated it. And what came out was something that they had never actually seen before in their lives, a fire elemental. Now, I want to pause for a moment to explain something out of character. I mentioned earlier how you can have significance by having something mentioned and then the party understands it. You can also do that by lack of mentioning it, or rather having the party never encounter something shows how rare that something can be. In this case, this was another example of that. Elementals, actual living functional elementals are extremely rare, despite the elemental nature of the setting. And so seeing an elemental of any kind is very rare. None of them had ever actually seen this thing before. So a fire elemental showed up, and was a really, really brutal fight. You forgive me for not going over it in detail, but among the other things the elemental could do, it would mind control someone, so they would then do their best. And I told the players, you know, you can go ahead and keep control of your player, but you have to do your best to harm the party. And they were actually really effective at that. And then it would possess one of the statues, bring that statue to life, and use some powers of that statue. One of the things that happened was it possessed the statue of Gerlin and attempted to de-weave Sethos. Now, here's the interesting fact. I kind of figured this is actually it for Sethos. Again, safety's off. But Javan decided to use a prepared action and his lightning reflexes in order to leap in and try to destroy the book that the Gerlin statue was using in order to de-weave Sethos, and interrupted it. However, even for those few seconds, Sethos was basically completely just racked and shattered, and his soul was actually partially missing. All sorts of horrible stuff there. Now, for those of you who don't understand the significance of that, it should actually be theoretically impossible to de-weave anything that is alive, and even more impossible to de-weave anything that has the ability to resist that. This was a theoretical impossibility that just got accomplished, so they were still dealing with that. In addition to this, Javan also had his own elemental affinity basically violently disrupted by his interactions in this room. I'm just going to summarize that in a nutshell. After some examination, what they discovered was actually kind of interesting, that this room they were in, which we're going to describe as about this big, even though it's, you know, like 40 feet wide, he had crafted these walls kind of out of nothing. Probably out of the ruins of the floor, actually. And they were able to break through, and they found out that this was just kind of like a partition with a ceiling, you know, so they couldn't tell that they were in a larger room, in an absolutely massive room, like an entire stadium-sized room. And this was the room that actually had the ley line, you know, the tubules where the scions were lying in. Now, I say was because if you've paid attention in both Mary-Lascelles and Vassayan-Lascelles, each of the individual pods had been shattered, or I'm sorry, had been broken into manually, and Gerlin had bothered to slit the throats of the several hundred people there individually, one by one. For whatever reason, that was not the case here. It looked like someone had unleashed something incredibly powerful, like an explosion or a spell or whatever, from the point, from basically from where the party was, from that general location, and it had blown the room out completely. And there was just debris that had lined everywhere, and ash, and just the barest bits of things. Almost everything had been completely wiped out. And they realized that for whatever reason, he had done this here instead of there. They weren't sure why. They never actually figured that out. Now, as they were in, now that they've broken out, they realized, of course, that there was another teleport pad here. And as with the previous one, this one had been altered to automatically send them to another location. Now, they weren't really sure where it was exactly, but they had a guess. They figured it was the fourth island, Erlenth-Lascelles. Now, if you've been paying attention very closely, you'll remember that way back on Vassayan-Lascelles, Furnaciel and Flux discovered that something, called a shadow, which they still don't know what it is, had escaped through one of the connection lines into Erlenth-Lascelles. And based on that alone, they were very, very, very hesitant to go through it. On top of that, they were also hesitant to go through anything that Gerlin wanted them to go through. Some of the party members didn't fully understand the significance of this, so Furnaciel psionically shared with Snarg and with Guido, who also had the ability, communicated with them everything she felt and knew about the shadows, and it was so violent, it actually required them to do a willpower save to avoid, completely just being overwhelmed by it. That's the full extent of how horrible that memory was. And she hadn't actually interacted with or seen one. Now, they decided to experiment this pad very, very carefully, and they managed to roll very well. They discovered that Gerlin had been in a great deal of haste for whatever reason, and in so doing he had actually tripped a safety feature in the pad that he was probably unaware of, maybe? And it enabled the teleporter to allow translation to another location called Third Facility. Now, this is actually really important. I actually hadn't mentioned this up until now, but I wasn't actually really expecting them to do this, to be honest with you. But this is important because every other facility has big, flowery, fancy names, like, you know, the grandiose first halls of the golden land that call unto psionicism in preference towards military matters and blah, 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 you know, that kind of thing. This place was just called Third Facility. So they found that very curious, and they decided to go ahead and work with several party members working in conjunction, engineering, weaving, knowledge, etc. Finally managed to change it to so that its destination was set to the third facility and went through it. Now they have no idea where the third facility is. In fact, they still don't know that to this day. But when they got there, it was dim, it was dank, and it smelled really, really horrible. When they got here, they found these massive, very deadly-looking cannons, the kinds you would see on a military-grade airship, and these cannons were trying to power up and destroy the party. And the party was like, oh my god, what do I do? But the cannons would not actually fully function. Now, the party spent quite a while examining this room. I'm just going to lay out in detail what this room was like, okay? Or in semi-detail. There's a lot of pits here. A lot of these pits have waste residue in them. And when I say waste residue, I mean whatever was in there used to be alive, and obviously hasn't been for a really long time. It's also very clearly almost entirely sealed off, and whatever power supply was keeping this place going is obviously nearly completely gone at this point. In here they learn that the Scions had developed a last-ditch effort in order to escape their war with the Shadows. They had developed a new type of energy, core energy, I mentioned that earlier. And this was the reason they developed this was because they realized that there was no place on this planet they would be safe on. And so they had plans to go ahead and head up to the moon. However, there are no ley lines on the moon, and that's what powers, like, all psionic technology and magic. So they needed a new power source. Now, this room was actually developed years prior to that. And it was built using a prototype of core energy, which is why that energy is now, you know, run out, basically. It is not self-fulfilling. It was just, you know, very durable, and it lasted for 3 centuries, or however long it actually lasted. And so, on top of that, they discovered that this room had been set up by someone who was being referred to as His Eternal Splendor. Now, they have no idea who or what. They have no context for this at all. But the name, or the title, I suppose I should say, the moniker, is mentioned on several occasions, His Eternal Splendor, and he was insistent that they work in this place. What they were doing was they were developing ways to augment the soul, I mentioned this in brief earlier, in order to protect and allow certain types of things that were very, very specific. Now, here's the thing. They put all this time and effort into specifically changing people so they could specifically pierce certain types of defenses so that they could be resistant to massive amounts of fire elemental damage, and so they would be immune to being de-weaving, and so they would have a general sort of resistance towards damage themselves. All of these things would require massive effort and time, and they were doing these experiments on many, many lesser beings, which in this case means anything that is not a scion. The thing that gets interesting is the curator who was doing this place obviously had no trouble experimenting on lesser beings, obviously because he's a scion. But His Eternal Splendor insisted that they speed this up, that they get results, and so His Eternal Splendor insisted they start experimenting on scions. Now, the curators, I shouldn't call him curator, the gentleman, the scientist who was dealing with this place, his reaction to this was disgust and horror. Kind of like if you had been asked to start operating on a kitten who's still alive, you know, just start cutting its limbs off or whatever. You know, kind of like a decent human being would respond to having to do these experiments on anything, but now it was really being hammered into this guy because he was having to experiment on scions as well, which was just unheard of at the time. Now, on top of that, after some serious digging, they finally found out something very, very interesting. All of these augments, all of this information, all the resources and power that had been put into this place was all being developed for the sole, singular purpose of developing weapons in order to combat one person. And I bet you already know who I'm going to say. Gerlin. Who, just to make sure you are clear on this, yes, he is a scion. Now, one of the other things they find out is that they had people hidden on all 4 of the Lascelles assisting in this operation. That's actually really significant for reasons I'm not sure I can really spoil right now, but for now, I'll just let that thought percolate in the back of your minds. Anyone who actually views these logs, by the way, and tries to figure out what happened to the people who were the failed experiments, literally had to succeed at a fortitude roll or throw up from how disgusting the results were. Mere weeks before the cataclysm, as the original party had referred to it as, or as the Scions referred to, as this party started referring to it as, which is Vanish Day, the people working here believed they had perfected the process in the short term. They weren't sure of long-term effects, but they could successfully augment the souls of the Scions in the 4 ways I mentioned earlier, and do so without completely eradicating or disgustingly, horrifyingly screwing up the individual in the question. So, Coulson, with some work in this filthy, disgusting room, managed to figure out how exactly to perform the procedure and augmented Javan's souls to perfect him against de-weaving. And there was a nearby machine that was used to emulate Gerland's de-weaving power, a feat itself which took years, and apparently they aren't even 100% sure it works properly, because, again, that should be theoretically impossible. So, after some great soul-searching, Javan decided he was going to go ahead and let them test it on him, even though it might eradicate him instantly, to see if it works. And this is actually a great moment, because none of the players, either characters or out of character, wanted to do this, wanted to be the one to push the button. And finally Guido says, fine, I'll go up and do it. And he reaches only, and his finger hesitates over the button for a while, because he's just... The thought of exterminating Javan here is horrible, but finally Guido pushes the button, and... nothing happens because, as I mentioned earlier, the power is really low in the facility, and so... and the players are like, oh my gosh. So they don't know if it worked. They go ahead and use the fire resistance ability on Guido, and they know that it did work, but it only worked for brief periods of time, so they'll have to figure out the rest of that in a bit. Meanwhile, at about this point, the Thog, the Rory Tusker, had been transformed back into Rory, and Rory and Furnasil had a fairly extensive argument about the situation. Rory was insistent that they kill Thog because it's his body and he was here first, basically, but the rest of the party didn't think it was so black and white. They felt that this was something they needed to figure out. And so Rory insisted that one way or another he was getting rid of Thog, and he was going to do so at his earliest opportunity once they get back to the Enethron facility. That also still has not been resolved. After a bit, they realized all the equipment in this room was designed to be mobile, probably so it could be transported from place to place as needed. In fact, this is likely not even the original room they were working in. So they decided to go ahead and take it to the teleport pad and decide where to go. Now, they have several options. They could take it back to Visayan Lascelles, they could take it to Mary Lascelles, they could take it to Erlenth Lascelles, or they could take it to the garden. The garden, I mentioned that earlier. Now, the party debated this for forever. But long story short, they decided to go ahead and take it towards the garden. Once they got to the garden, it was very different from compared to when Furnasil was here. However, there were still piles of the Gerlants, the G-coins, and still covering the flowers of the 4 islands, which Araguna immediately ran around and picked up all of them. Yes, really, that'll become important in a minute. Now, it took them several trips, about 3 hours actually worth, in order to carry all this equipment back and forth. On their final trip, they encountered an elite squad of human and 2 Tuskers in aetherite armor, which is something that's basically not really been encountered before. And they ended up here via the first teleporter, thanks to some tripwire or something. They weren't exactly sure what happened. Now, long story short, Stark tried to convince them that they needed the equipment, but the human and the Tuskers weren't having any of that. So long story short, several pieces of the equipment ended up going with them back, whereas and Snarg finally ended up coming back to Gardens, and he was like, okay, we've lost some of those pieces of equipment, but maybe we'll be able to talk to him and get it back later. Okay, sure. Now, they were really worried about being in the garden, because they were worried that A, any of the Tumora could theoretically show up in the garden at any moment if they figured out how to do so from Visayan Lascelles, and B, Gerland himself might show up at any moment. So they were really worried about what was going on, and they decided, let's scope out Visayan Lascelles. Let's see what's going on there. So they send a scouting party, which consists of Furnasil, Guido, Araguna and Snarg, I believe, to the research facility way back in Visayancel, if you remember that place. Now, when they get there, they find that the power is back on. No surprise, because the ley line was reconnected. It's the first time they've actually had that confirmed, though, that Visayancel was reconnected to the ley line. So it was good to reconfirm that. And they sneak their way through, and they find nothing, and they find nothing. And as they're on their approach to the room where the scanner is, which was their actual goal, because they figured they could scan all of Visayancel from that room, on the way there, they encounter a very crude-looking titanium stationary golem, which is just kind of implanted in the room. And it very, very nearly killed Snarg several times, just on approach. The group hastily retreated, especially when the alarms started going off, and realized they basically had no time to decide what they were doing next. They had to abandon the garden and flee back to the Tuskers. It was the only thing. So they teleport back into the third facility. And, Snarg and Araguna say, okay, we're going to go up to the surface and figure out what's going on. They teleport up, and what they found surprised them. Now, I want to stress this as clearly as I can, okay? It was a large pyramidal structure from the outside, right? Pyramidal structure. Urgh! From the outside. And it's this big old thing. Well, when they teleport in, imagine if this... Okay, let's do it. Well, okay. Here's the floor, right? And here's the actual teleport pad that they're supposed to teleport on. It was actually at about like this of an angle. So they teleport in here, and they just plummet, several dozen feet to the ground and take damage from it. Because the floor is actually jutting out of the ground, having been blown there. And huge chunks of the facility are just strewn everywhere. It is a complete disaster. It is ruined. It is destroyed. Now, if you remember, the nature of the Lascelles is to slowly rebuild themselves based on the ley line energy, and certainly the facility is trying to do that, but it's having a hard time reconstructing something this massive and under these circumstances. So, long story short, it's just everything's just kind of vibrating, and everything's horrible, and they're like, "Oh my God, what the hell happened? We have no idea what to do." And as they crouch amongst some debris, and they hear a really loud noise, and by loud noise I mean loud noises like machinery moving, large chunks, and they look over and they see dozens upon dozens of crude, brutal-looking titanium golems, all of the same style they'd been encountering, but different make. There was one that walked on 4 legs that had 2 cannons coming out of its head structure, and there was one that was walking around on like spider legs, that kind of thing. There were all sorts of these things, just kind of in a small army moving through the area. Apparently they were seeing the very tail ends of it, because whatever this group was had obviously destroyed the facility on its way through. And they realized that they were heading north towards where the Tuskers' cities would be. The party decides very quickly they need to get the hell out of here. And about this time, Rory decides to come through the teleporter and ends up here, trapped as well. But Snarg has a good plan. He's going to go ahead and use a rope with a catch to try and link it to the edge of the floor, so it'll go shkunk and catch up here, and he'll be able to climb up and activate the teleporter. So it works. He gets it latched. He sends Aragorn up. He sends Rory up, and he climbs up himself. And as he's climbing up, I forget what he was trying to do, but he wanted to do something like get the rope, I believe, actually, on his way out. And as he's doing so, several flying titanium golems start showing up and look like they're about ready to shoot him at a moment's notice. And so he decides he no longer has any time to do anything. So he goes ahead and just uses the teleport pad and gets the hell out of there. Now that they're back in the third facility, they realize that they're completely screwed. So they decide the only possible choice would be to teleport to Mary Lascelles, because there's no way they're going to Airlint. So they go ahead and teleport to Mary Lascelles. Now, I never really described the depths of Mary Lascelles, but where they end up is basically a massive library. That's where the pad is in Mary Lascelles. There's actually only 1 instead of the usual 3. And it's this massive library area, and all sorts of knowledge and books and data disks and all sorts of that sort of thing, right? They get there and they catch their breath for a minute, and then they realize, after a moment, that Hanuel is gone. Hanuel and Dara both. And they look around and they start examining, and nobody can actually remember the exact moment Hanuel stopped being with the party. But it was somewhere during all the teleporting they've been doing, and they don't really know what to make of that. But Hanuel is gone. Now, they really don't know what to do about this. So they decide, okay, let's figure out what we can do, okay? So At this point, they decide they have a break period. And so Coulson and Jovan both ask Fear Nacil to do the psionic link so they too can read and understand the psionic language. So she does, and as usual, that knocks all three of them out because it's just such a horribly changing situation. So all three of them just go and are effectively brain dead. Snarg goes out and decides to try and look out, scout out the area. Now everything is, I want to stress, the overall tone here, you know, they go from bad to worse to oh my god, there's an army on Aphis Lacil, let's run! And then on Mary Lacil, everything is completely quiet and peaceful, okay? Snarg goes out, and at this point probably getting dulled by surprises. As he's walking through the hallways of Mary Lacil, the Sanctum there, he encounters a perfectly ordinary-looking goblin, just kind of standing there. And the goblin looks up, and without even the tiniest bit of surprise at seeing Snarg there, says, "Why aren't you at the south wing?" And he says it in Undercommon. Now, Snarg was pretty good at thinking on his feet, and so he immediately says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I got lost. Yeah, I'll head there right now," and heads off. This is actually wonderful. It was basically a one-on-one role-playing session. Snarg, the character, starts going through, and he finds a large number of other goblins, kobolds, gnolls, and a few gnomes, one centaur he encounters. You may or may not recognize several of these individuals and of their races or the significance thereof. One of the other things he finds out is that all these people had been led here by someone they call the boss. They never reference who he is exactly, obviously, because Snarg couldn't just say, "Who's the boss?" You know, then he'd have lost his cover. Similarly, he also realizes that virtually all the goblins he sees here also have the ability to read and understand psionic language, just like he does. And he really doesn't know what to think about that, because he got it from Fear Nacil, and to his knowledge, she's the only scion running around. Thirdly, many of the goblins present were from the Death Touch clan. Now, you may or may not remember that, but there was an individual Snarg saw quite a while ago during the longest day in Hultberg, named Gavin of Death Touch. Gavin was the one who was talking to the leadership of all of Alluvia as if he was their superior. And, you know, same clan, in other words, is what I'm trying to get across. And finally, like I said, he finds a centaur researcher. Oh yeah, there was a mite here too. What he finds out is that they're all studying this sanctum in order to learn everything they can about it. And there's actually quite a few of the Wildpaw clan of gnolls here, which is probably why they didn't even blink when they saw Snarg. Oh yeah, there's also mossworts and drudges too. I forgot to mention that. Now, by literally sheer chance, this was another dice roll thing, Snarg stumbles across a knowledge sphere. Now, I've never actually mentioned that before because it's something the party hasn't actually encountered yet, but a knowledge sphere is exactly what it is. A knowledge sphere is a sphere of solid perial with well, I shouldn't say solid perial. It's basically like a circuit, okay? It's a massive spherical perial circuit, and what happens is scions will do this and imbue upon to it all the information and knowledge that they know about something, and it will retain that, right? Well, this knowledge sphere happens to contain a great deal of information about how the scions had perfected their farming technology. Because if you've ever thought about it, they managed to feed everyone from all four Lacels from basically a minuscule amount of farmland on this one island, on Mary Lacel. And that's incredibly efficient, incredibly well-designed, incredibly perfected farming techniques, right? Now, Guido and Snarg, because Fear Nacil is kind of out of it at this point, were all mind-linked, and all of them realized that this kind of information could literally end world hunger, could actually stop the problems of food that exist in Dareth today. And so Snarg, was like, I have to get this. This is so important. I have to get this sphere. His decision was wonderfully pragmatic. He spent some time looking around the sphere, like, well, whatever, and he just grabs it and heads off with it, making like he's going to go take it, back to his superiors or whatever. And no one even stops him because he's acting like a regular gnoll at this point. They have one last problem on the way out. One of the goblins guarding the area, but thanks to some mental trickery, they managed to get by him, and whoosh, they're back. Now they realize that they're literally on a ticking clock here. Oh, I'm sorry, there is one other thing. They do learn, there's a name drop here. They learn that the organization that this group is a part of is called the Sun. And that's all I'm going to mention about that. So, they manage to get their way back, and they realize, we need to get the hell out of here. And they start thinking about options, and thinking about options, and thinking about options. Finally, someone points out they still have an exit materia, a level 8 exit materia, which can exit 8 people. They refused to use it up to this point, other than when they were getting Zeiss out, because they've had more than 8 people in their party. However, ironically, with Hanuel gone, they now have a party of 8. So they go ahead and use the exit materia. Now, I'm usually prepared for them to use that materia because I'm aware that they have it, and I always have basically a chart of places they could show up at. So I go ahead and roll the dice, d20, to see where they land, and they land something interestingly. They land, did I put the, yes I do. They land within visual distance of a town, actually a city really, called Thramata. Now Thramata is a town at the very southern end of the Navarre, Confederacy. And it's a bit of a tourist town, but it's mostly catering to the rich and the elite aristocracy from Osteth, Show, and Navarre. Incredibly fancifully built. It's actually built up rather than out, and there's whole layers of magically suspended roads and stuff like that. Incredibly interesting architecture. And of course, the proximity of this place to the air ley line is also helping, and that's the other interesting thing. They're literally only a few hours travel from the air temple, which happens to be right over there, which is actually where they where this particular destination was on the destination chart. They go ahead and decide, okay, after all this, we need a night. We need a night's rest. So they go ahead and decide to pay for the room with several of the Gerlins they have, the G-coins. The rooms were literally the most luxurious, fancy, comfortable rooms they've ever seen in the lines. The temperature, the sound, the humidity, the lighting, and the very physical design of the room would morph itself around to whatever it is you wanted. It would respond to your desires. And so, for example, Javan and Coulson, who were both already, they go into their rooms, and it was so comfortable that they could no longer keep themselves functional. So they went in, and literally, the room instantly adjusts itself to them and becomes perfectly comfortable, and they just pass out, just boom, gone, they're asleep. But the funny thing is, even though they pass out on the floor, the carpet actually moved up and moved them up onto the bed so they could actually sleep on the beds. A few other people did a few things. Araguna got paid for some room service, got some things with that with the Gerlins. Rory decided to go ahead and have a view of the coast, a coastal town, that kind of thing. A bunch of other stuff like that. However, one other thing happened before they ended up for the night, and that is the fact that Rory wanted to head out. By the way, it is just now approaching nighttime on this one day. This has been a long day. Like I said, Rory heads out and decides to have a yellow mage who happens to be in town try to analyze one of the G-coins. Simply trying to analyze it traumatizes this individual so terribly that Rory realizes there's a great deal of risk here, but he is exhausted and they can't deal with it right now. So he decides to go to bed along with the rest of them. And then, well, I guess we'll find out next. We're almost caught up, I swear. But that was just the whirlwind of events of their adventure on Aphis Lacelle. I was really pleased with those sessions, and I hope you enjoyed listening to them. I will talk to you soon.